The morning sun drifted softly through the lace curtains of Taylor Hart's living room, spilling across the pale wooden floor like a watercolor wash. She sat on the edge of her armchair, phone in hand, her thumb hesitating above her son's number. The house was quiet except for the gentle tick of the clock and the distant hum of church bells somewhere beyond Forsyth Park. Today was supposed to be special, the day her only son, Blake, would get married. She had polished her shoes the night before, pressed her soft pink dress, and even reheated leftover cobbler to share after the ceremony. When the call finally connected, it wasn't Blake's voice she heard. It was Diana's. "Oh, Taylor," she said, her tone smooth and distant. "We already got married yesterday." Taylor blinked. "Yesterday?" she whispered, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Yes," Diana replied, the sound of clinking glasses in the background. It was just a small ceremony. Only special people were invited. For a moment, silence swallowed everything, the faint wind, the clock, even the air in Taylor's lungs. She stared at the phone, still pressed to her ear, until the call ended with a polite click. The world felt smaller somehow, colder. The pink dress hung by the window, untouched, its fabric catching the light like a cruel reminder. She had imagined watching Blake smile at the altar, his hand trembling with happiness. Instead, she sat alone, her reflection blurred in the glass of the framed photo on the mantel. Blake at 10 years old, grinning, his arm around her shoulders. Taylor rose slowly and walked to her writing desk. There, in neat folders, were her check stubs and receipts. She had kept them all. Every month's rent payment she'd sent for Blake and Diana's apartment, $900, 36 times. She had helped them furnish the living room, replace a broken refrigerator, pay off a car loan. She had covered their groceries more often than she could count, telling herself it was what mothers did. Now, as she traced her finger down the columns of numbers, the truth began to settle in. Over $50,000 gone, poured into their lives while they celebrated without her. The air in the room felt heavy, almost foreign. She walked back to the window and looked outside. The oak trees along the street were dressed in Spanish moss, their shadows long and still. Savannah was waking up, joggers passing by, a neighbor walking her dog, but Taylor felt completely apart from it all. Her throat tightened, not from anger, but from something deeper, quieter, the ache of being unwanted. The humiliation didn't arrive like thunder. It came softly, like a hand pressing over her mouth. She turned toward the pink dress one last time. The satin shimmered faintly, as if waiting to be worn. Then she reached up, unhooked it, and folded it carefully into the back of the closet. Her hands didn't shake, but her voice, when she finally spoke aloud to the empty room, was little more than a whisper. "I suppose," she said, "I wasn't special enough." The next morning arrived gray and quiet, the kind of Savannah morning that smelled faintly of salt and magnolia. Taylor sat at her kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling beside her untouched. The small clock on the wall marked each second with mechanical indifference. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, Diana's words echoed back. Only special people were invited. Now a yellow legal pad lay open in front of her, filled with careful rows of numbers. Taylor had always been methodical, the kind of woman who labeled her spice jars and kept every receipt. But as she added the last column, her pen trembled. The total stared back at her. $52,000. $52,000. 3 years of rent payments, furniture, groceries, a new set of tires for Blake's car, the down payment for Diana's salon chair, even the security deposit on their apartment when their credit hadn't been enough. Each act of love, she had told herself, was an investment in their future. But sitting there under the cold kitchen light, it looked less like generosity and more like erasure. She had paid for her own disappearance. Her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Blake's name. For a moment, habit almost won. Her thumb hovered over the green button, but then she lowered her hand. The phone rang until the sound dissolved into silence. For the first time in her life, she chose not to answer. That decision, small as it seemed, felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. By mid-morning, Taylor found herself standing beneath the cool marble columns of Savannah Community Bank. The lobby smelled faintly of paper and coffee, a scent she had always associated with security. Behind the counter stood Robert Mendoza, a man she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. He had once worked with her husband, back when life still felt steady and predictable. "Taylor Hart," he said with a surprised smile. "It's been too long." "Too long," she agreed, her voice steady. "I need to make a few changes." They sat in his small office, sunlight spilling through the blinds in sharp stripes. Taylor explained everything: the transfers, the joint payments, the automatic drafts. Robert listened without interruption, only nodding occasionally. When she was done, he slid a new set of papers toward her. "Cancel the old transfers," he said gently. "Open this in your name only. You've earned the right to protect what's yours." Taylor took the pen. The weight of it felt different this time, not heavy but firm. She signed each document with deliberate care, her signature curling across the paper like a quiet declaration. When it was over, Robert shook her hand. "You're doing the right thing," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the distant sound of a church choir. Taylor stood on the steps for a moment, eyes closed, letting the sunlight touch her face. It wasn't joy she felt, not yet, but something else, small, fragile, and alive. Control. By late afternoon, the Savannah air had grown heavy, carrying the slow hum of cicadas and the faint smell of rain. Taylor sat on her front porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the street shimmer under the low sun. It was the kind of quiet she cherished, until a dark SUV turned onto her lane and rolled to a stop in front of her house. Blake stepped out first, wearing the same navy shirt she had given him for his last birthday. Behind him came Diana, her heels clicking against the pavement like tiny strikes of judgment. A third man followed, well-dressed, briefcase in hand, eyes calculating. "Mom," Blake called, forcing a smile as he climbed the porch steps. "We need to talk." Taylor's stomach tightened. "You could have called." Diana brushed past her husband, her tone clipped. "We thought it'd be better to discuss this in person." She gestured toward the stranger. "This is Mr. Ramirez. He's been helping us sort out some concerns about your finance." The man extended a hand. "Mrs. Hart, I'm an attorney. Your son and daughter-in-law are worried about a few memory lapses you've had recently. They just want to make sure your affairs are in order." Taylor didn't take his hand. "My affairs are just fine." Blake exchanged a look with Diana. "Mom, come on. You've been forgetful lately. You left the stove on last month. I was boiling eggs, Blake. I turned it off when they were done." Mr. Ramirez opened his briefcase, sliding a stack of papers across her porch table. "It's a standard power of attorney agreement," he explained smoothly. "It simply allows Blake and Diana to help manage your finances in case of emergency. It's very common at your age." Taylor stared at the document. The words "power of attorney" sat bold and confident at the top, like a threat dressed as concern. Her heart thudded once hard, then steadied. "I see," she said softly. "And who suggested this idea?" "You, Diana." Diana's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're just trying to help. It's for your own protection." Taylor lifted her glass and took a calm sip of tea. "You must think I'm quite the fool." Blake's jaw tightened. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Oh, I won't." She pushed the papers back toward Mr. Ramirez. "Because the only power of attorney in this house is me." For a second, no one spoke. Then Diana scoffed under her breath, turning away. "You're being ridiculous." "Maybe," Taylor said quietly, "but I'll be ridiculous on my own terms." Blake tried again, softer this time. "Mom, enough." Her voice cut clean through the thick air. "This conversation is over." She stood, opened the screen door, and waited until they stepped off the porch. The sound of the SUV door slamming echoed down the empty street. Inside, Taylor locked the door, one hand resting against the cool metal latch. Her fingers trembled, but her breathing didn't falter. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, soft but certain. Her hands shook. Her voice hadn't. 2 days later, the morning light in downtown Savannah was sharp and golden, spilling between the old brick buildings that framed Whitaker Street. Taylor walked slowly toward the law office of Charles McKinney, her purse clutched close to her chest. The brass nameplate beside the door glinted in the sun. McKinney and Associates Family and Estate Law. She had passed this building countless times with her husband years ago, never imagining she'd return here alone, and for this. Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. A secretary led her through to a room lined with old casebooks and certificates framed in dark mahogany. Charles stood to greet her, his salt and pepper hair and steady posture giving him the kind of calm authority that instantly put people at ease. "Taylor Hart," he said warmly, shaking her hand. "It's been a while. How have you been holding up?" She hesitated before answering. "Not great, Charles. I think my son and his wife are trying to take over my finances." His expression shifted from polite to intent. "Tell me everything." Taylor explained how Blake and Diana had arrived with a lawyer, the document they wanted her to sign, the way they'd called her forgetful, unstable. As she spoke, her voice steadied. The tremor of shame she'd felt that day began to fade, replaced by something else, clarity. When she finished, Charles leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Taylor," he said slowly, "what you're describing isn't just manipulation. It's a textbook case of elder financial abuse." The words hung in the air, heavy but strangely liberating. "They're preparing a case for guardianship," he continued. "It's a legal move that can strip you of control over your money, property, even medical decisions. They'll claim you're not capable of managing your own affairs." Taylor's breath caught. "But that's impossible. I'm fine." "I know," Charles said gently. "But we'll make sure the court knows too." He pulled out a yellow notepad and began listing steps in neat, confident handwriting. 1. Change every lock on the property. 2. Install security cameras front and back. 3. Update your will and power of attorney documents, naming a neutral executor. 4. Alert your bank and primary care physician about possible fraud or impersonation. When he looked up again, his tone softened. "From now on, you protect yourself like you would your child." Taylor blinked, surprised by the words. Protect herself. She hadn't thought of it that way before, not as self-defense, but as care. Charles handed her a folder with copies of new legal forms and his direct number written across the top. "You're not alone in this," he said simply. Outside, the late morning breeze carried the faint scent of river water and azaleas. Taylor paused on the sidewalk, the city alive around her. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders lifted. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was preparing. By the end of the week, the bruised heaviness that had filled Taylor's chest began to ease, replaced by a quiet steadiness she hadn't felt in years. The sky over Savannah shimmered with late afternoon light, the air sweet with jasmine. She had just finished watering her porch plants when her phone rang. The name on the screen made her pause. Diana Hart. Taylor hesitated before answering. "Taylor," Diana began, her voice soft, practiced. "Blake and I have been thinking. Maybe things got out of hand. We'd love to take you to dinner tonight, just to talk." Taylor could almost hear the script behind the words. Apology wasn't in Diana's nature. Strategy was. She imagined Blake beside her, nodding silently, waiting for the chance to steer the conversation toward money again. "Dinner sounds lovely," Taylor said lightly, "but I'm afraid I already have plans." "Oh, with who?" Diana's tone sharpened, curiosity cracking through the sweetness. "Myself." Taylor's smile was calm, almost kind. "And Diana, I told you, I only help special people." Before Diana could respond, Taylor ended the call and set the phone down. The silence that followed was almost musical. A few hours later, Taylor stood in front of a small salon tucked between a florist and an antique bookstore on Bull Street. The glass door chimed as she entered, the scent of shampoo and lilac wrapping around her. She sat in the chair and met her reflection. Her hair, once long and carefully kept for Blake's wedding, now seemed to belong to someone she no longer recognized. "How short?" the stylist asked. "Short enough to start over," Taylor replied, when the scissors began to move. Locks of silver and chestnut drifted to the floor like the shedding of old skin. With each snip, something inside her lightened. When it was done, her reflection startled her, not because she looked younger, but because she looked like herself again. Afterward, she wandered into a boutique down the street and bought a soft blue dress, one that caught the light when she moved. It wasn't expensive, but it felt like an affirmation. Then, on a quiet impulse, she walked into a small cafe overlooking the square and asked for a table for one by the window. As she sipped her soup, a woman at the next table leaned over with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, "but I couldn't help noticing that you look like someone who's decided something important today." Taylor turned, meeting her gaze. The woman introduced herself, Renata Lawson, a retired teacher, graceful and kind-eyed. Taylor smiled. "You could say that," she answered. "I think I've just remembered who I am." Outside, the city lights flickered to life, and for the first time in a long while, Taylor didn't feel like a mother left behind. She felt like a woman beginning again. The morning air on Taylor's porch carried the soft hum of cicadas and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle drifting from the fence line. A few days had passed since her dinner at the cafe, and in that short time, something in her life had shifted. She no longer felt like a shadow in her own story. Now, every sunrise seemed to arrive with a quiet invitation to keep going. Renata Lawson appeared that morning with a basket of lemon muffins and a smile that made the world feel less sharp. She had the gentle ease of someone who'd weathered many storms and learned not to apologize for surviving them. "You don't have to eat alone every morning," Renata said, setting the basket down. "Besides, I needed an excuse to escape my grandson's cartoons." Taylor laughed, the sound still unfamiliar in her mouth. They sat together on the porch swing, its old chains creaking softly as they swayed. Eventually, the conversation turned from small talk to something real. "I told you the other night I used to help my daughter," Renata said. "Helped too much, if I'm honest. Paid her debts, co-signed her car, even covered her credit cards." "What happened?" Taylor asked. "One day," Renata said, eyes narrowing at some invisible horizon, "I realized I was raising a woman who didn't know how to stand without leaning on me. So I stopped. She didn't speak to me for a year, but eventually, she grew up." Taylor absorbed her words, the truth of them heavy but kind. Renata reached over and squeezed her hand. "Sometimes you have to love your children enough to let them face life without your wallet." Taylor smiled faintly, though her throat tightened. "It's easier said than done." Renata nodded. "The good lessons always are." Later that afternoon, as sunlight slanted across the porch, Taylor's phone rang. It was her sister, Diana, calling from Tampa. Taylor answered, expecting a casual check-in. Instead, Diana's voice trembled with unease. "Taylor, I hate to be the one to tell you this," she began, "but I ran into one of Diana's old co-workers at the salon down here. She said Diana used to joke that when you're gone, they'll remodel your house. Turn it into some beach-style rental or something. For a moment, the words didn't register. Then they did, clear, cruel, and deliberate. Taylor's grip tightened around the phone. "I see," she said softly. "Thank you for telling me." After the call ended, she sat perfectly still. The shadows from the porch railings striped her dress like the bars of a cage. But this time, the tears that came weren't born of despair. They carried something pure, clarity, resolve, the painful acceptance of truth. When she finally wiped her eyes, Taylor looked out toward the street where the moss hung low from the oaks and whispered to herself, "No more." A week later, the peace Taylor had built began to tremble. The morning was damp and still, gray clouds pressing low over Savannah. She had just finished her tea when the sound of tires crunching on gravel made her look up. A black pickup truck pulled into her driveway, its engine idling like a growl. Her stomach sank before she even saw who stepped out. Blake and Diana. 2 other men followed, a pair of strangers, thick-shouldered and silent, the kind who didn't come for conversation. Blake slammed the door and stalked up the porch steps. "You've gone too far, Mom," he shouted. "You've been spreading lies about us all over town. People are calling, asking questions." Taylor rose slowly, keeping her hand on the porch rail. "I haven't said a word to anyone, Blake. The truth doesn't need help traveling." Diana crossed her arms, her eyes sharp and glittering. "You've made us look like thieves. You're embarrassing yourself and us." "I don't recall asking for your reputation," Taylor replied calmly. One of the strangers took a step closer, his boots heavy against the wood. "Maybe we should all go inside," he muttered. "Talk this out." Taylor's heart raced, but her voice stayed level. "You're not welcome here." She reached behind her and quietly pressed the small remote on the porch table, the one Charles had given her to trigger the security cameras and alert. "The police." Diana's voice rose, brittle with fury. "You think you can just ruin our lives and hide behind some lawyer? You're old, Taylor. You can't handle this." Taylor held her gaze, unflinching. "Then why does it scare you so much that I'm trying?" The argument swelled, their voices overlapping, anger bouncing off the porch columns like thunder. But Taylor didn't retreat. She stood her ground, steady as the oak tree in her yard. Minutes later, the wail of a siren cut through the noise. A blue and white cruiser pulled into the driveway, lights flashing against the gray sky. Officer Johnson stepped out, followed closely by Charles McKinney, who had driven straight from his office after receiving the alert. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded. "She's lying." Blake snapped. "She's turning people against us." Charles spoke firmly. "Officer, these individuals are violating a harassment statute under Georgia law. We already have documentation." Within minutes, statements were taken, voices lowered, and the 2 strangers stepped back, muttering. Officer Johnson handed Blake a folded document from his clipboard. "This is a temporary restraining order. You and your wife are to stay at least 100 feet from Mrs. Hart's property until the court hearing. Any violation will result in arrest." Blake's face flushed with humiliation, but Diana pulled him away, whispering something sharp in his ear. They left without another word. Taylor watched as the truck reversed down the driveway, the sound fading into the distance. Rain began to fall, soft and steady, darkening the porchwood. She turned to Charles and Officer Johnson, her voice low but certain. "Family doesn't threaten you for money." And as the patrol car pulled away, leaving only the hum of rain and the whisper of moss in the trees, Taylor exhaled deeply. For the first time in months, she felt something close to peace, safe, grounded, and entirely her own. The following week, Savannah woke beneath a blanket of low clouds, the air thick with the smell of rain-soaked azaleas. Taylor had just finished sweeping the porch when a car she didn't recognize pulled into her driveway, a white sedan with a small state seal printed on the side. A woman stepped out, clutching a brown folder to her chest, her expression polite but firm. "Mrs. Taylor Hart?" she asked. "Yes," Taylor replied, straightening. "I'm Raquel Mendez, from Adult Protective Services. We received a report from a family member expressing concern about your mental health and financial safety. I'd like to conduct a wellness check and go over a few questions with you." Taylor's breath steadied. She could almost see Blake's signature behind this visit, the last desperate attempt to discredit her. Still, she opened the door and gestured inside. "Of course. Come in." The living room smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. Everything was spotless. Curtains drawn neatly, books stacked in even piles, framed photos dusted and aligned. Taylor motioned for the caseworker to sit. Raquel took a seat at the dining table, flipping open her folder. "Do you live alone, Mrs. Hart?" "Yes." "Do you have regular contact with family?" "I used to," Taylor said evenly. "Not lately, but I have friends, neighbors, and a very good attorney." Raquel nodded, jotting notes. "The report also mentions some confusion over your finances. Have you had any recent trouble managing your accounts?" Taylor smiled faintly. "None at all." She stood, opened a drawer in the sideboard, and retrieved a folder thick with papers. "I thought someone might ask." She laid the documents on the table, bank statements neatly tabbed, receipts organized by month, even a handwritten summary of her expenses and income. Each column was perfectly balanced. Raquel's eyes widened slightly. "You're very thorough." "I was a librarian for 30 years, Taylor said. "I know how to keep things in order." As Raquel reviewed the papers, the sound of tires on gravel signaled another arrival. Charles McKinney stepped through the door, holding his leather briefcase. "Morning, Mrs. Hart," he greeted, then turned to the visitor. "I'm her attorney. May I ask the purpose of this visit?" Raquel hesitated. "It's just a wellness check based on a report from family." Charles opened his case and produced a copy of the temporary restraining order and a log of recent harassment. Attempts by Blake and Diana. If the report came from them, it's part of an ongoing pattern of elder financial abuse. We have substantial documentation on file. Raquel studied the papers, her expression softening. After a long pause, she closed her folder. "I see what's happening now." She looked at Taylor with genuine regret. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Hart. You're clearly capable, and this report will be marked as unfounded." Taylor offered a small, gracious nod. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Mendez. I know you're just doing your job." As Raquel left, Taylor stood by the door, the scent of rain drifting in from the porch. For the first time, she felt the scales of justice tilt, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, back toward her side. 2 quiet weeks passed, the kind that made Taylor almost forget the sound of shouting. The azaleas around her porch were beginning to bloom again, pink and full as if the world was trying to heal with her. She had spent the morning writing in her journal and brewing tea when a sudden knock shattered the calm. Through the screen door, she saw 2 unfamiliar faces, a man in a gray suit and a woman in medical scrubs holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Taylor Hart?" the man asked, flashing an ID she barely had time to read. "I'm Dr. Richard Vega, psychiatrist, and this is my assistant, Patricia Gomez. We've been sent to conduct a mental capacity evaluation. It's part of a court request filed by your family." Taylor's pulse quickened. "I wasn't notified of any court order." "It was expedited," Vega said smoothly, stepping closer. "We just need to ask you a few questions inside. It won't take long." Patricia added, "If you refuse, we'll have to note your noncompliance." Taylor froze for a moment, her fingers brushing against the phone on the table behind her. Then she smiled faintly. "Of course," she said. "Why don't you both come in? I just need to call my attorney so he can join us on speaker." Legal procedure. You understand. She dialed Charles McKinney's direct line as she led them toward the living room. Her voice was calm, almost casual. Hi, Charles, it's Taylor. I have 2 visitors here, Dr. Vega and Ms. Gomez. They say there's a court order to assess my mental health. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then Charles's voice, sharp and clear. Do not answer any questions. I'm calling the police right now. Keep them there, but don't engage. Taylor set the phone down on the table. Speaker still on. Would you mind waiting here while we get that paperwork verified? Vega frowned. That's unnecessary, ma'am. But Taylor didn't move. She stood between them and the doorway like a quiet wall. Minutes later, the faint wail of sirens approached from down the street. Vega's expression stiffened. Patricia shifted uneasily, clutching her clipboard. When Officer Johnson stepped through the front door, his uniform still damp from the drizzle outside, Charles arrived right behind him. These 2 are in violation of a temporary restraining order, Charles said firmly. Blake Hart and his wife arranged this under false pretenses. Vega's confidence faltered. We were just following instructions from the family. The family, Charles interrupted, has no legal authority here. This visit is harassment. Plain and simple. Officer Johnson took their information, escorting them toward the door. Patricia whispered an apology as they left, her voice trembling. Vega said nothing, his polished composure replaced by embarrassment. As the car doors slammed shut and the siren lights faded down the street, Taylor stood in her doorway, the echo of it all slowly dissolving into silence. She turned to Charles and said quietly, her tone steady as a prayer, People who love me don't need to test my sanity. Charles nodded. And sane people, he replied, don't need to prove they're sane. For the first time in a long time, Taylor smiled, not out of victory but relief. The house finally felt like hers again. A month later, the spring air in Savannah had turned heavy with humidity, pressing low against the courthouse square where azaleas bloomed in impossible shades of pink. Inside the Savannah County Courthouse, the echo of footsteps mingled with the hush of legal murmurs and the distant hum of ceiling fans. Taylor sat beside Charles McKinney at a long oak table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her heart beating with slow determination. Across the aisle sat Blake and Diana, immaculate as ever, he in a gray suit, she in a cream dress that seemed chosen for innocence. Between them lay a stack of documents thick enough to crush reason. Petition for guardianship, the heading read. The claim that Taylor Hart was mentally unfit to manage her affairs, that she suffered from confusion, emotional instability, and memory decline. The attachments included letters, one allegedly from her neighborhood pharmacist, another from a next-door neighbor, both claiming concern for Taylor's deteriorating state. Taylor's stomach turned. She recognized the names, but not the words. They forged them, she whispered. Charles nodded grimly. Already confirmed. We'll dismantle every piece. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, but preparation began that afternoon, as if war had been declared. At Charles's office, walls filled with case files and framed degrees. Taylor sat across from him while he made a list in his precise, looping handwriting. We need 3 pillars of defense, he said. First, testimony, people who've seen you functioning independently. Second, professional validation, medical and psychological proof of competence. Third, character witnesses, people whose words carry moral weight. Let's start, Taylor said quietly. Their first stop was Savannah Community Bank, where Robert Mendoza greeted Taylor with a firm handshake and a smile that felt like sunlight through rain. You tell that court, he said, that I've watched this woman balance her accounts better than half the clients in this town. I'll testify to that under oath. Next came Dr. Elena Morales, Taylor's longtime physician. When she learned what was happening, her expression darkened. Unfit? That's absurd. I've run her medical evaluations for years. Her cognitive results are excellent. She agreed to perform a full psychological assessment, one that would stand up in court. Renata, too, didn't hesitate. They picked the wrong woman to underestimate, she told Charles with a fierce smile. I've shared mornings, meals, and memories with Taylor. Her mind is sharper than mine on my best day. Day after day, the pieces came together. Witness statements, notarized documents, certified results. The small law office transformed into a command center of truth. One evening, after reviewing the final packet of evidence, Charles leaned back in his chair. You're ready, he said. Whatever they bring, we'll meet it head on. Taylor looked down at the paper spread before her. Proof of sanity, strength, and self-respect, and exhaled slowly. I never thought I'd have to defend my own mind, she said softly. Charles smiled. You're not defending it. You're reclaiming it. Outside, the courthouse clock struck 6. The sound rolled through the warm evening air, steady and clear, like a countdown to justice. The courtroom awaited, and this time, Taylor would walk into it not as a victim, but as a woman armed with truth. The morning of the trial broke, humid and gray, over Chatham County Courthouse. Where oak trees lined the square, like solemn witnesses, Taylor stood at the courthouse steps beside Charles McKinney, her silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears, a pale blue jacket pressed smooth. The marble facade loomed above her, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid to be seen. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Reporters weren't present, just a few locals who had heard whispers of the family dispute that had split the Harts in two. At the front sat Judge Eleanor Price, her expression unreadable beneath half-moon glasses. When Blake and Diana entered, all heads turned. They were dressed in black, their faces carefully composed with solemnity. Diana even dabbed her eyes with a tissue as if rehearsing for sympathy. Their attorney, Gregory Shaw, rose dramatically as the session began. Your Honor, he began, my clients are heartbroken. They love Mrs. Hart deeply, but she has become increasingly confused, manipulated by individuals with ulterior motives who have taken advantage of her vulnerability. This petition for guardianship is not about control, it's about protection. Charles didn't move, didn't even blink, but Taylor saw the small muscle in his jaw tighten. Then it was their turn. Charles stood, calm and deliberate. Your Honor, this case is not about protection, it's about power. What my client has endured is a calculated attempt to seize her assets under the guise of concern. He began to call witnesses, each one stepping forward like a note in a rising symphony of truth. First came Robert Mendoza, the banker, his voice steady. Mrs. Hart manages her finances with precision. Every withdrawal, every deposit, she verifies herself. She's sharper than most clients half her age. Next, Dr. Elena Morales, with her clipboard and calm authority. I've evaluated Mrs. Hart personally. She exhibits no cognitive impairment whatsoever. Her memory, reasoning, and executive function are fully intact. Then came Renata Lawson, who met Diana's glare with unwavering grace. Taylor isn't confused, she said simply. She's heartbroken. There's a difference. Each statement chipped away at the facade Blake and Diana had built. Their lawyers' objections grew weaker, their confidence thinner. By the time Charles called Taylor herself to the stand, the air in the courtroom had shifted, charged waiting. Taylor stood, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of everything unsaid. When my husband passed, she began, I thought love would hold what money couldn't. I helped my son and his wife because that's what family does. I paid their rent, their bills, their debts. But when the money slowed, so did their affection. She paused, her gaze steady on Blake. It wasn't love. It was a transaction. My money was welcome. I wasn't. The words settled over the room like a heavy silence. Even the judge looked up, her expression softening behind the glasses. For the first time, Blake dropped his eyes. Diana's tissue slipped from her hand, and in that stillness, Taylor didn't look like the frail widow they'd painted her to be. She looked like what she had always been, composed, clear, and finally heard. The afternoon light streamed through the high windows of Chatham County Courthouse, painting gold across the polished wood and softening the tension that had filled the room all morning. Judge Eleanor Price adjusted her glasses and looked over the papers before her, the faint hum of the ceiling fan the only sound breaking the silence. Taylor sat very still beside Charles, her hands folded in her lap, her heart steady but expectant. Across the aisle, Blake and Diana whispered furiously with their lawyer, their faces pale beneath their practiced calm. Finally, the judge spoke. Her tone was measured, deliberate, each word striking the air like a bell. After reviewing all testimony, evidence, and expert evaluations, she began, this court finds no basis to question Mrs. Taylor Hart's mental competence. The guardianship petition is denied. A faint murmur rippled through the room. The judge continued, her gaze landing on Blake and Diana. Furthermore, given the submission of forged documents and false statements, the court orders the petitioners to reimburse all legal expenses incurred by Mrs. Hart. Taylor exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her body like the weight of years dissolving at once. Charles placed a quiet hand over hers, a simple, steadying gesture of victory without spectacle. Blake's chair scraped against the floor as he rose, muttering something about misunderstandings. Diana tugged at his arm, her face hard and unreadable. The two of them exited quickly, the sound of the courtroom door closing behind them, softer than their silence. Judge Price's voice softened as she looked at Taylor one last time. Mrs. Hart, you've conducted yourself with dignity through an ordeal that would have broken many. You may leave here today with your name and your peace restored. Outside, the air was warm and bright. Taylor stood on the courthouse steps, lifting her face toward the sunlight. For the first time in months, her shoulders didn't ache from the invisible weight she'd been carrying. The oak trees along the square swayed gently, their shadows long and kind. She turned to Charles, smiling faintly. It's over. He nodded. It's just beginning. A few days later, Taylor drove along the familiar road toward Bonaventure Cemetery, the moss-draped oaks arching above her like silent sentinels. The world was quiet except for the distant trill of birds. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, simple, the kind her husband had always liked. Kneeling beside his grave, she brushed away a few fallen leaves and traced his name, carved into the cool marble. I finally learned, she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. Love isn't proven by money. For a long while, she sat there in the dappled sunlight, listening to the rustle of the wind through the branches. Then, as the sky began to deepen into amber and rose, she rose and made her way home. That evening, Taylor settled onto her porch swing, a cup of tea warming her hands. The light spilled gently across her yard, turning the moss into strands of gold. She closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm of the swing, the softness of the air, the fullness of quiet. Freedom, she thought, is the most expensive gift, and I finally paid for it.